So the Global Deal promotes inclusive growth and decent work through social dialogue. And today we are discussing a topic that's really at the heart of social dialogue, which is living wages. Social dialogue is really crucial in wage setting more generally, in particular in setting living wages that take into account both the needs of workers and their families. And economic factors, as it's also set down
Ja, det var på Nordic.
by the ILO conventions, including the Convention on Minimum Wage fixing. So we really see social dialogue as helping to strike a balance between ensuring decent living standards for workers, but also sustainability for enterprises. So as you know, or most of you know, we've already looked at minimum wages in the past. There was a focus group on living wages that was held in 2022, was completed at the beginning of 23. In fact, it was the first focus group I attended just the last couple of sessions when I took over the leadership of the Global Deal unit. We issued a note, a thematic brief on living wages last year at a webinar. So we've already worked on this topic and we are now updating that note because there have been important developments. So last year, a major step milestone was achieved at the ILO to define living wages. And so during our webinar today, we're very pleased to have Patrick Belzer from the ILO, who will tell us more about the meeting of experts on wage policies that took place in February last year at the ILO to develop technical guidance specifically on living wages. And he'll also tell us how social dialogue can play a key role. At the same time, of course, there's been developments in terms of actions, particularly by several multinational companies that have increased, stepped up efforts to promote living wages around the globe. And today we'll hear from Global Deal partners that have implemented relevant initiatives, and they will tell us how they've done it with a particular focus on how social dialogue has played a role in these negotiations and initiatives. So let me now introduce our speakers. As I just said, we have the pleasure of having Patrick Belzer, who's a senior economist at the ILO in Geneva, where he leads the work of the Global Wage Group, and he's the principal editor of the ILO Global Wage Report, which is a flagship report published every 2 years since 2008. And in this role, he played a central role, of course, in the expert group that I just mentioned. Then we have Daniel Kotzer, who's a chief economist at ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation. So previously he served as the senior regional wage specialist for the International Labour Organization in Asia and the Pacific, and held several positions at World Bank, the UN Development Program, and Argentina's Ministry of Labor, and he's also a specialist on the topic. We have Talita Moreira, who's originally from Brazil. She's a group compensation expert at Michelin, where she started in 2018, and since August 2023, she's based in France, where she works specifically as an expert at the Michelin Group compensation team. But she also began earlier in her career in the field of compensation back in 2010, working for many multinational companies in Latin America. We have Alistair Smith, who is the international coordinator and executive director at Banana Link. So I said we would also have some of our partners who have directly been involved in promoting living wages. So Banana Link is a UK-based not-for-profit cooperative which works for fair and sustainable banana and pineapple trades. Alistair will tell us about the experience experience of banal, particularly in the Côte d'Ivoire. And last but not least, we have David Chichon, who is the head of program at ACT, Action, Collaboration and Transformation, which is an agreement between 20 global brands and the Industrial Global Union in pursuit of living wages for workers in textile and garment supply chains. And now that I've done the introductions, I think we can go straight into hearing what our speakers have to say. Feel free to post questions in the chat, so I'll be monitoring the chat and we can ask our speakers your questions once we have finished the first round of points that we would like to address. So starting from Patrick, who can help us set the scene. So I've said it a couple of times already. There was this tripartite meeting of experts, Patrick, that took place at the ILO in February last year to discuss wage policies, including living wages. And the ILO Governing Body subsequently adopted the conclusions of the meeting of experts. So could you tell us, please, explain the concept of living wages according to the ILO based on this meeting, and highlight the principles along which the estimation of living wages can be based, and also focusing, of course, on the role of social dialogue to establish and implement living wages.
Thank you very much, Glenda, and good afternoon to everybody. And thank you very much for having me on this panel. So indeed, we had in the ILO, we had the first ever tripartite meeting of experts on the issue of living wages in February of last year. So even though we have living wages mentioned in our ILO constitution, we never really had a tripartite agreement on the issue of living wages and on the concept of living wages. So I think it was to some extent a very historical achievement and a historical set of conclusions that we reached in the ILO. And perhaps the first point to emphasize when we talk about social dialogue is the fact that these conclusions were reached through a process of social dialogue at global level, since our meeting of experts are tripartite. So they have participation from workers, participation from employers, and participation from governments. Normally there are 8 members of each group with spokespeople. And so we can say that the conclusions that were reached are already the fruit of constructive social dialogue. And in that sense, they are very important for us because, of course, there are global agreement that has been endorsed by our ILO governing body in March of this year. So they have become really the ILO conclusions on this issue of wage policies, including living wages. And I should emphasize this because really the discussion was not just on living wages, it was about wage policies in general and how living wages is not an isolated issue in the broader framework of the discussion on wages, but how living wages should be seen as a part of the broader discussion on wages. And so I would like to share with you perhaps the main the heart of the agreement, if you wish. Let me see if I can share my screen. Please let me know if you can see this. So I suppose you can see my screen. So really the agreement.
Sorry, we can see the screen in, you have to change invert the displays. There are no notes, but we can see your notes if they are there. Okay, perfect now.
Yeah, there are no notes, luckily. So basically, the group reached a joint understanding on the concept of the living wage, and this is really 3 things which have been agreed together as part of this global negotiation. which first is the fact that the concept of the living wage is the wage level that is necessary to afford a decent standard of living for workers and their families, taking into account country circumstances, and very importantly, calculated for the work performed during normal hours of work. So no overtime necessary to reach the living wage. But then in that ILO concept of the living wage, there is also the issue that this living wage should be calculated in accordance with some principles, which were defined during the meeting, and also to be achieved through the wage setting process in line with ILO principles on wage setting in particular, of course. So in going quickly into these two main dimensions of estimations and operationalizing of living wages, let me highlight first, of course, the importance of the notion of social dialogue and collective bargaining, which has been really discussed throughout the negotiation. And it was emphasized in particular that living wage estimates should contribute to and inform an evidence-based social dialogue for wage setting. So there's the idea that when you estimate living wages, is not just a mathematical formula that is going to replace social dialogue, but it is something which is done in order to inform social dialogue, and that's very important. And now when it comes to the principles of estimating the living wage, there are some good practices such as transparency, having a peer review, having a public availability of the estimates, but also very importantly, to have the involvement of social partners throughout the process of the estimation, and also to make sure that there is national or local ownership of the exercise that's being done, because there's been a lot of emphasis from our constituents that they don't want to be presented with a number which comes from somewhere else and which doesn't involve any discussion with them. Now, going very quickly into the last point, which is perhaps even the most important point, which is how living wages should be achieved. And here again, the idea is that living wage should be achieved through social dialogue and particularly collective bargaining, which are crucial mechanisms to operationalize living wages. And at the same time, that is very important that also when we discuss living wages, we take into account, Glenda, as you said, both the needs of workers and their families and economic factors, because the capacity to pay of enterprises, the productivity, and other economic factors are very important in making living wages a reality for people and for workers. There is also the idea of incremental progression from minimum wage to living wages, the idea of ensuring national ownership, and to take into account the root causes of low pay, which can include low productivity, but also the issue of how distribution of value is shared in supply chains. And so all of these issues should also be taken into account when operationalizing, because it will not be possible to just make it happen from one day to the next just by estimating a number. And with this, I stop. I think this was a very quick overview of those conclusions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. Actually, extremely useful. And it's good to have Daniel here from MeTook. And you've just said it, Patrick. One of the points was also to foresee an incremental progression of minimum wages towards living wages. So this is something that we want to discuss with Daniel. So there are, Daniel, persisting challenges, of course, for achieving living wages, despite this agreement that was reached at the expert meeting last year at the ILO, including law enforcement of the instrument that we we already had, which was minimum wages, employers citing economic factors hindering higher wages. Patrick has also mentioned this. We have to also be mindful of the situation of employers, there's capacity to pay, but also competition between countries on the basis of low wages and lower and labor standards. So can you please, I think in this context is important to be able to differentiate, but also see how the two come together, minimum wages and living wages. And so over to you to tell us a little bit more on this and what can be successful strategies to achieve this incremental increase from minimum wages to living wages that Patrick was talking about.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, well, actually, we have to start differentiating the two concepts. The minimum wage, it's a very clear legal concept. The minimum wage, it's understood as the raw base salary that the company or an employer should pay to somebody in an employment relation. And that's defined legally. It's defined either by national wage councils, by the law and what the legislation says, or whatever administrative rule. It could be collective bargaining, but it also could be statutory, that the government decides to implement according different things. It has to do with the necessary to earn that money in order to have a decent life. And it's legal, and the other is much more of a socio-economic concept. And it was part of the discussion because when Patrick mentioned the purchasing of certain goods and services within a certain time, should a person work in order to buy what goods and services are there, which also it's like a recursive effect. And it's not that this was not a factor, the needs of workers and the family. Other wages in the economic conditions that would also affect in the definition. The important thing here in this discussion is, number one, that the ILO and the world community, the tripartite setting, recover a concept after 80 years. The last time that ILO talked about living wages was in the Philadelphia Declaration. Philadelphia, 1944, 80 years. And that's not because workers didn't want to discuss that, on the contrary. The other important thing is that talk about, and here I would like to extend a little bit, talks a lot about the national ownership, the social dialogue, and the collective bargaining at local level. And why this is important, and I think that here a number of international institutions, private, public, companies, multinationals, that they are really concerned, and we welcome this concern of achieving living wages. They should understand that the use of a benchmark that is defined outside of the framework of the national discussions in the process of social dialogue may preclude other type of negotiation. Because while it's true that in most of the negotiations you are discussing wages, especially minimum wages, but also those negotiations involve the discussion of other factors like working time, additional payments, bonuses, holidays, OSH factors, occupational safety and health, that are very relevant for the workers and for the livelihood of the workers. So when some people comes with a international benchmark using a rule of thumb and purchasing power parities, an indicator that I have my doubts about its relevance, or it's I would say statistical consistency, you should be aware that you are to some extent, while attending the discussion on wages partially, you are precluding the relevance and the participation of workers to discuss other things. So just to wrap up here, my claim would be for those that are interested, country pays the wages, is to push governments, to push employers, to push your global supply chain, your suppliers, to sit down and negotiate, because that's the only way of defining a reasonable or a sensible living wage for the workers. And in the cases, because that's another the argument that always come, and we achieve some sort of agreement at the experts meeting, they say, well, but minimum wages in general are 5 times lower or 3 times lower than the living wages. Well, to achieve the path for the convergence, the incremental progression towards the living wage. That's very important to be completely aware, and that's also can be achieved only by local social dialogue, not by international benchmark, independent of how good they are. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks a lot. I think from what you told us, it's very clear. I mean, the rules around the central rules is very clear. And now we're going to hear from some concrete implementation examples from Global DL partners. And I'm happy to give the floor to Talita. So, Talita, in 2024, Michelin introduced living wages for its employees around the world. You are referring to those decent wages and saying they should ensure that the employees can provide for them and their families essential needs, while also providing for unexpected events and buying consumer goods. So this is how you define them. But we're particularly interested in hearing how the amount of living wages, the level of the living wage was defined. So you used, if I'm right, the Fair Wage Network to help you do that. Can you tell us a bit more about it, especially how the setting of living wages or decent wages for Michelin was done?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us to share our experience. So, in fact, living wages started at Michelin by 2020. So we did start the discussion a while ago. We had the first introduction of this topic in the company, and in the first moment during the pandemic chaotic situation, we had the president of the group that was very sensitive and very supportive in this topic. And I have a very a phrase that I use a lot when I share how he supported us, where he says that performance cannot be based on social deprivation. So with his sponsor on the topic, we started to look how the market is working on the topic. So our first step was to do benchmarks. So we had the information that some companies were already working on the topic. So we start contacting them to see how they were working with this topic, how they were evolving on this topic. And then we also got a lot of time to study the ILO definition, what the United Nations Global Compact approach is about this topic. So we were not trying to define a concept. We were trying to check the concept that meets our values. And then we checked a lot of NGOs, so non-profit organizations that were providing estimations on the living wage. And we decided fair wage. We saw that there are a lot of, each year more options of providers of living wage. But at the moment, so in 2020, we want to implement not in a specific location. So today, Michelin is based in more than 60 countries and based on more than 1,000 cities. And we want to implement in every place at the same time. So we decided fair wage because they had the most completed base for us to use as a reference. And when we define it, the concept, as I said, we use the concept, and we found the methodology that they present on the standard family that meets the standard that we were looking, because we do have a remuneration practice, the same practice all over the world. So we were trying to also implement a global approach because we also have, we are a very international company. So we didn't want to implement one politic in South America and another politic in Europe and one start comparing with each other. So we decided one politic to whole group. And in this topic, fair wage was very meeting this need. Well, in fact, when we do work living wage, we were not talking only on salary. We also take in consideration fixed elements that is guarantee to the employees. And when I say guarantee, it's easy to explain. What is guarantee? Is when the employee knows how much and when he will receive. So these are the topics that we consider. And the first thing that we did when we got those references from Fair Wage. First, let me say that was very challenging because in many countries, Michelin is not based in the capital cities. So it was very challenging to find the reference, and sometimes we still need to look more bases and challenge crossing bases to find a good or current reference based with our local contact. So we are all the time. We are so as you said, Linda. Now I'm based in France, but I work all the time with local contacts. So we work it with them, and we start measuring the gap. So this started in 2020, and then since then we start understanding how the references was evolving and how we should do to adapt in each city, in each specific location, how we should work to close this gap. So this job took us 3 years. So since 2020, we decided that 2023 we were not going to have any gap in any company from Michelin Group. So I'm not only talking about Michelin industry tires, but all companies that are part of the group. With the support of our president of the group and our executive director of human resource, they said it's no choice. We must to move. We must to close the gap. If we need to find savings, if the volume or if the price, if we have another save that we need to do, we will not do in our workers. We will need to find another ways to make our profit as good as we should be with our shareholders. So workers, it's a non-negotiable topic, and we must go. So since 2023 was a lot of discussion on how to close the gap. So it's not a formula that you can apply the same formula in every place. So each place was discussed at local level, how we can improve the total remuneration of the workers at the location. So sometimes was in the salary, sometimes was in the other fixed elements that I mentioned that we also consider as living wage. And then we are still working and learning as the topic is still evolving. We are here with you learning also, and we want to also improve and share what we did that I think was very good improvement to the topic, but we know that there is a road to go, and we are very interested to capture how other companies and ILO, with this ILO definition, how we should move forward in the next years. I hope it's clear. Thank you, Glenda, for the question.
Very clear. Thank you so much, Talita. I think in particular, very interesting how you wanted to have this consistent approach globally, but then you were able to root and you especially identified, fair wage in particular, because it gave you an opportunity to root then the calculations, the level, and you said even the elements, whether it was the wage or other fixed elements in the local situation, which is something that Patrick mentioned, and also I think David mentioned that too. I also take away, it seems to me that this also succeeded for you because it was implemented because because there was a very strong leadership. So, it's not just the headquarters, it's a big group. So you need to convince all the parts of the group. And so you need to have a strong leadership that believes in setting living wages and is able to convince the others of the importance, which is something that came out often in the focus groups discussion we have. I might be very convinced, but then I work with a very broad range of companies within the group, and it's sometimes hard to have a consistent implementation across because they may not share my vision about living wages. So I think this element of strong leadership and strong agreement from the top that then infused, if I understand right, is something else important to take away from your example. And now I'm moving to Alistair. So another interesting example. This time is Banana Link. So I've explained before what Banana Link as an initiative is. So it's been implementing a program on decent remuneration for banana plantation workers in Côte d'Ivoire since 2020. And there was a major agreement in 2024, which was reached with social partners, forming a group to negotiate a first sectoral agreement by 2026. I understand this was a very long process, Alistair, that took several years, but maybe you can focus on how Banana Link has supported this process, and also what were the key challenges and how did social dialogue play a role in overcoming those challenges.
Thanks, Glenda. Yeah, you've given the punchline, so I will try and fill in the 4 years between 2020 and 2024. So the same period as Perita's talking about in Michelin. So the origins, let's say, of why a small British-based NGO should be facilitating such a process. The actual origin was one big global retailer who was motivated for and had made public commitments several years before to living wages for all the workers in its banana supply chains. So that was the original motivation from our side. Also, why did we focus on Côte d'Ivoire? Because, to be honest, there were some of the biggest wage gaps for a large proportion of the lowest paid workers. So those were the two motivating factors that got the program underway in 2021. So just to go through 5 or 6 key factors in getting where you've just described, where we reached at the end of September last year. So firstly, our role as a small NGO has been facilitating the dialogue beyond just one company. One of the 5 banana exporting companies did have levels in important advances in social dialogue already, but in the other 4, I think it's safe to say there was little or no social dialogue going on. And I'm deliberately keeping it simple, so please come back to me with questions. So the first element was that facilitation beyond just one company, obviously using unions and the company in that company which had showed the way to work with other companies, work with other unions on the one side and work with other companies on the other to encourage them to be part of a national process. So that's the first factor. The second factor was quite a few of the resources that we were able to raise were for trade union capacity building, because it's all very well to talk about living wages, which is what trade unions' bread and butter, it always has been, but there's a whole living wage movement, a whole load of tools. Somebody referred to benchmarks. They're out there, whether we like it or not, they are there, and the trade unions need to be able to navigate that complexity. So the training was absolutely vital in terms of equalizing the chances of good social dialogue, which would lead to collective bargaining. So the program was called Preparing the Sector for Collective Bargaining. It was very explicit, and maybe I should say now but there were 6 retailers, 4 of whom are part of the global Big 5 international retailers, who co-funded the program together with IDH. So they co-funded the program on the understanding that the approach was through collective bargaining. So, of course, when the ILO mandate arrives, that's helps us justify why we were arguing a little in the dark sometimes, a little against people's better judgment sometimes, that collective bargaining was the only sustainable long route to negotiating living wages. But anyway, so just to say how important the ILO mandate was in the last 6 months of the process. But to continue the other factors, another key factor was was a national research institute, an independent research institute attached to National University in Abidjan, which played a vital interface role between the companies, using initially a salary matrix tool provided by IDH and the unions. So they dealing with very sensitive data, which is anything to do with wages and remuneration, wages plus bonuses plus indemnities, allowances in English, I think is better. But that composition of remuneration is sensitive information for any company. So the interface of a national research institute, which wasn't regarded as an outsider, which isn't an outsider from Côte d'Ivoire point of view, played a really important role in interfacing, and then in 3 of the 5 companies actually verifying with the trade unions wage data that had been provided to them as an intermediary, if you like, which we didn't get to see as a small NGO facilitator. So the 4th element was that on both sides of the social partnership, so on the company side, 2 trade associations which didn't really talk to each other came together for various reasons, not just because of the program, but because of issues around certification, but issues around benchmarking for living wages. Many reasons brought 2 associations together, and a lot of thanks go to the African Regional Banana Producers Association for facilitating that. On the trade union side, the first ever national federation brought together initially 8 and now 12 trade unions in all those plantation companies. There are 5. So a 5th factor that led to the critical moment back in February, almost a year ago, in Abidjan, where the parties sat for 2 days and agreed to set up a joint working group which would co-design the national collective bargaining framework. That was agreed back in last February. It was rubber stamped by all the players in September, as Glenda's referenced. But that working group, with equal membership from both sides, on the workers' side, the trade union side, and on the company side, is charged at the latest by September 26th with designing a national collective bargaining agreement for the first time ever. So the parties were in place, federated at national level, both on the employer's side and on the workers' side, and that was absolutely critical. Obviously, I've mentioned the role of buyers. They bought in, as it were, to the process on the understanding that collective bargaining was the best way forward. And in a country where there are trade unions in place with the freedom of association and some history of social dialogue, that was the model they bought into. And that's why I say that when ILO got its global mandate, that's made convincing some of these big global retailers much, much easier. And maybe the last point is about government, the role of government. So at the end of September 24, when the roadmap was presented to all partners, 3 government ministries were present. And there is now an agreement that, for reasons which I can explain if you're interested, the banana sector, the banana collective bargaining agreement for banana workers, some 15,000 directly employed workers, that will need to be taken out of the pre-existing agricultural wage agreement, because this is a completely export-oriented sector, whereas most of agriculture is national. That's a whole set of issues, and I'm not going to go into it now, but we do have 3 ministries of government buy-in, including about minimum wage, the agricultural minimum wage revision, which ILO has been pushing for many, many years, but I think I'm hopeful that there will be some progress on that quite soon. So I'll stop there. But yeah, 4 exciting years where some of the results we did not predict 4 years before, and very, very positive. I'm speaking from Abidjan as well.
Nice. Thank you very much, Alistair. You certainly have better weather than in Paris today there. But this is great. I mean, I think you've very much showed us what many of the points that were made by Patrick initially can mean then in practice, right? So the role of social dialogue came through very clearly. I think you made a point that's quite interesting that we hadn't heard before about the sensitivity for employers of sharing this data. So the importance also of having a body, when you said the actual level, that was, let's say, connected to the process, but not, but say, who guarantee that this information will remain, private and so on. That guaranteed that the information would be treated appropriately, and it was an external body. So that I think is an interesting point that you made. Let me now move to David, last but not least, to give us a third example of the practicalities of implementing or supporting the implementation of living wages. So ACT, I think I mentioned that before, is an agreement between 20 global brands and industrial global union in pursuit specifically of living wages for workers and in textile, for workers in textile and garment supply chains. And in Cambodia, ACTA supported brands and industrial in reaching individual bargaining agreements that will support then living wages. Can you please tell us more about the significance of these commitments that are undertaken by individual brands and how these are supporting negotiations between social partners and in Cambodia?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Glenda. I know that I'm the last one before anybody can ask their questions and go wild, so I'll try and keep it brief so we have some time for questions. Just to clarify, I think briefly, I think what we've done and what we're very delighted to be able to have done is to support individual brands and industrial global union in signing the first ever legally binding agreement, which set out a support for collectively bargained wages in Cambodia. So the collective bargaining agreements in Cambodia, the agreements between brands and industrial outline the legally binding support that these brands make for the agreement. I think this is significant, in particular, as it is the first time that brands have made legally binding commercial commitments in support of wage growth. The agreements are structured to support the Cambodian industry as well as provide support and incentives to individual factories that sign collective bargaining agreements. And the key areas in which brands make these commitments are related to sourcing volumes, labor costing, so how wage increases and labor cost increases are incorporated into prices, as well as a contribution to a skills training and development fund. So the way in which this agreement came together is also significant, I think, looking at it from a perspective of the global deal and specifically in light of the ILO recommendations and so on, as they were the outcome of a joint endeavor between manufacturers, unions, and brands. So these commitments that the brands have made are tailor-made to the industry in Cambodia. They address the priorities of the social partners and really are there to be a key enabler to support collective bargaining agreements on wages, but also, as Daniel pointed out, of course, collective bargaining agreements are a vehicle to address many other elements that are of interest to employers and unions in the industry, and really to allow the collective bargaining agreements and I think the social partners in the country to be in the driving seat of this process. The agreements that the individual brands have signed include a monitoring element. And I think this is really important because it speaks to the way in which these are different and unique in the industry. They include a monitoring process, including external verification of labor costing, but also a dispute process which leads all the way up to, if necessary, binding arbitration, international binding arbitration in The Hague. So it's the agreements that the brands have signed, as well as, of course, the collective bargaining agreements in Cambodia, are two sets of enforceable agreements that are interlinked, that work together. This is the outcome of a really complex supply chain industrial relations endeavor between manufacturers, unions, and brands. We know, the garment sector is a highly complex, very dispersed global supply chain, lots of actors, lots of different elements in the supply chain. And so really what we've supported is the setup between manufacturers, employers, and unions of the supply chain industrial relations framework that has these two interlinked sets of binding agreements. On the one hand, the brand signing legally binding agreements with Industrial Global Union, where they outline for the first time commercial commitments to support collectively bargained wages. And on the other hand, collective bargaining agreements in factories in Cambodia that are based on a collective bargaining agreement template, a CBA template, which was developed through the social partners in Cambodia, which really addresses wages and benefits, but also other elements that were important to the industry, including skills development, productivity, industrial peace, allows really, I think, an avenue to create a new structure of industrial relations, which wasn't there before this process. I think what is key from our learnings, and I know we only have 10 minutes left, so I'll try and wrap up the potential impacts here. And I think what we see as the key learnings in a way is that the structure was developed between brands, employers, and unions through nearly 2 years of negotiations, and represents what we believe is the first of its kind in terms of a supply chain industrial relations framework with legally binding support for collective bargaining agreements. And so it is two sets of enforceable agreements. It's very important because, suppliers, manufacturers, employers, they sign a collective bargaining agreement. Those agreements are binding. And so the fact to have a counterpart where brands outline commitments that are also legally binding was a very important element of this process. Just, I think, very, very briefly, this long-time collaboration, so this 2 years of negotiations of setting up the structure and so on, were crucial because we could see that there's no shortcut to developing industrial relations, right? And I think in terms of meeting the ILO recommendations that Patrick outlined, we have the ownership of the national social partners, which is absolutely crucial in the process. There's a relationship between the negotiated wages and the collectively bargained wages and the minimum wage process, which in Cambodia has been going on an annual basis, at least for the last 12 years already. There's no sort of external benchmark that is used in some way, but as Daniel said, it's really about the collective bargaining agreements used by the social partners as a way to address what is important to them in the industry, not just when it comes to wages and benefits, but also other elements like maternity leave, paternity leave, whatever it might be, that is important, I think, to the unions and the employers at that moment. And I think linking that to the supply chain element, linking that to a legally binding support, sort of closes that loop in some way and allows to the framework by which the social partners in the country can have the ability to collectively bargain with the support from other elements in the supply chain that have an impact on the standards in the workplace. So in a way, what we tried to do, or what I think happened in the way this has all come together, is that there is a framework which addresses many of the elements that Patrick mentioned from the ILO's perspective, but also tries to go beyond that by setting a legally enforceable structure that the supply chain can support this agreement. It's the first time the global government in the global government industry that brands have entered into legally binding agreements to support manufacturers, workers, and the industry with wage development, specifically wage growth. And we really hope that it can be expanded upon now, of course, and through the rollout of the collective bargaining agreements in Cambodia, become a blueprint for how the supply chain addresses wages and wage growth. I'll stop there, Glenda, but if there's questions, I'm very happy to take them, of course.
Thank you, David. And now, of course, it's over to the chat. So please feel free to put in questions that I can pass on. In the meanwhile, I do have one question for Patrick. So going back to the start, Patrick, you were saying that these expert groups also came up with principles for the calculation of living wages. I think you mentioned that the regional and local, so the geographical elements, so the routing into the national situation, because there was this concern that otherwise they will be fixed somewhere else without little consideration of the situation. But were these concrete principles that the experts came up with, and how do they fit with what you've heard, for example, in the examples we've had from Michelin, from ACT, and from Banana Link?
Thank you, Glenda, for this question. So I have an echo here. I don't know. Yes, it's gone. So yes, as you say, the ILO agreement is a set of principles and a set of recommendations, if you wish, plus also a mandate for the ILO to assist its member states in undertaking some work on these issues of wage policies, including living wages. So we are working with the support of a couple of donors in some of our member states, which have shown interest in working with the ILO on these subjects, and which have formulated demand in that direction. And this includes countries as diverse as Costa Rica, Colombia, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, Vietnam, and India. And of course, in all those countries, the country-specific solutions are growing out of the social dialogue process. And so India is very keen to work with the ILO on this issue of estimating and operationalizing living wages. At the same time, there's a long history, of course, in India on working on concepts of fair wages and also on estimating living standards. And so the discussion is really also about how to find the concrete application in each situation of those principles. And so that's also what strikes me when I listen to all the participants, is that there are different ways in which social dialogue can take place, different ways in which processes evolve. And it's nice to see. I mean, this is really, I think, the idea that there is no universal recipe which just you can pull out of the drawer, but that there are some principles which are very important, and that's what the contribution of these ILO conclusions are. So over to you, Glenda.
Thank you, Patrick. We do have a question. So from Vivian Rangel from GIZ. In the case, I'm reading it out. So in the cases where collective bargaining was implemented, was this covering 100%? That's a good question. 100% of the workers? Was 100% of the workers part of the workers' union? If not, I guess this is about how did you deal with workers who may have not been represented by a union the moment where you have the living wages going through collective bargaining, which applies actually to many other workers' rights. I don't know if Talita, David, or Alistair want to say a few words on this. Perhaps, Talita, do you have anything to say about how it was implemented, is being implemented by Michelin?
Well, what I can say about this question is, as I mentioned in my moment, it was very top down. So we did for all 100% of workers, and we also very careful on equal job, equal pay, and not doing any discrimination, no matter any contract detail. We were very attentive on this to include all workers in the site.
Alistair, I see you've unmuted.
Daniel asked first.
Daniel, then, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Alistair. To be honest, there are no countries where you have 100% of coverage of the collective bargaining. That's why there are minimum wages. In the country, I think I said in Germany, you trusted in collective bargaining until 2015, when you found that a large amount of workers have been left behind because of the lack of collective bargaining, because of precarious labor conditions. And here I would like to praise the role of ACT in Cambodia. Cambodia is a country I've been there many times in my previous role. It's a country that they really found that with the negotiation, with the setting of the minimum wage, was the only way in which they would have social peace. It's a country that was very much worried or reactive to violence. If you remember, in 2014, people died in the street fighting for the minimum wage. The government with the social partners decide a very clear chronogram or calendar for negotiations. In July there are some numbers, in August there are meetings, and they end up in November with the new value of the minimum wage that we implemented since the 1st of January. So they had this practice, and it's another great example, Cambodia, on how brands that many times they look aside and say, well, we cannot force our suppliers, or there are other restrictions there, how they can bring to the table and negotiate because they can do it. The argument that I remember 2016, 2017 in Cambodia was, we are losing competitiveness because our wages are much higher than the ones in Bangladesh. I'm sorry if I'm giving names and example. They started at the same level, Cambodia and Bangladesh, with the adjustment of minimum wages. And very rapidly, Cambodia reached a level that was around the $200 per month. That was much higher than the one in Bangladesh. And at the same time, because of the actions and the reputational benefit that Cambodia got because of this negotiation, Cambodia increased the exports of the garment sector much more than Bangladesh. So I would tend to say, we cannot expect that 100% of the workers are there. That's why there are minimum wages. That's why the living wage and the minimum wage, they have such a strong connection. And that's why something that we fought a lot at the experts meeting, which is the progression and the convergence between the minimum wages and the living wages at the end. And one last point in relation to the ability or the capacity of employers to pay. I would like just to remain a quote by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, when they were ending in the middle of the financial crisis. He said that if some enterprises need to pay sub-living wages in order to survive, those enterprises, we don't want them. They are not contributing to the economy of the country or to the well-being. What's the opposite of a living wage? I don't know. That's something that should be very clear when it comes to the calculations and the determination of the remuneration. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. There are some interesting questions coming up. We'll try and take the two that are there now, and then I'm afraid we need to close. So the first one is about, perhaps, for example, for Talita, but also for Daniel, if you have any thoughts, or of course for Act and Alistair as well. But so someone's asking, well, what do you do if employers cannot pay the living wage, right? So that's often what we hear. It's a nice idea. As I said before, it often happens that, the idea is, for example, we've heard it in a focus group, comes from, say, the headquarters of the company, but then some of the suppliers to which the policy of living wages is recommended by would say, well, yes, it's all nice talk, but I cannot afford to paying living wages. What do you do to overcome this obstacle? How do you find the right balance? I suppose it's a matter of that, between giving workers a decent wage, living wage, and then at the same time taking into account the difficulties that some employers may have. You want to start, Daniel? Go ahead.
Yes, okay, no. Without opening, if an employer can pay, or a group of employers can pay, there are many instances in the administration of labor relations. You can start a procedure where you go, you show, you present the numbers. Determinants why a company can pay, they are various, and they are well beyond this transaction. And on pricing, the international crisis, those things can be analyzed and can be account. But again, you cannot expect in the same company with money, it cannot be that the worker will spend 1/3 of his life working without getting enough money to satisfy his needs or her needs and the needs of the families. That would be completely unfair and asymmetrical in terms of responsibility.
Thank you, Daniel. I see Alistair and then David after that.
Yeah, just what I was going to say on Vidya's question was that in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, about 65% of members of unions. There are multiple unions in all those companies, but there are union platforms who speak with a unitary voice, one voice, two management in each case. But 100% of what is negotiated will apply to 100% of workers in that case. On the question that somebody asked about how do you have a balanced decision, what I didn't say, and it's really important, is that the retailers who co-funded this process, who were being pushed by the perceived demands of consumers, let's say, in Northern Europe, the deal is decent price. You can't have decent work and you can't have living wages if people are not paying a decent price. And with a relatively short supply chain on a perishable product, it's absolutely flagrant that if companies are not receiving a fair price for the product that workers are producing, then it's not going to work. And that was an absolutely vital part of the last 4 years' discussions. And having 4 of the 5 big global retailers understanding that is quite a big step forward. Whether they'll understand it on other products other than their biggest value food item, we shall see. But I'm hopeful.
Thank you, Alistair. David, you also wanted to intervene.
Yes, thank you very much, Glenda. I think just quickly, both the last questions, but also I think that previously what Daniel mentioned on the process in Cambodia. I think this is where this is exactly where a collective bargaining process, and then I think an extended collective bargaining process, what we've tried through a sort of a trilateral industrial relations approach, which brings the brands into it, can find a way to address the interests of all the parties, right? So the workers that have an interest in ensuring higher wages and better benefits, the employers that had an interest in using the collective bargaining process to have a discussion on productivity and stable industrial peace and a stable industry, and brands who have an interest in addressing their due diligence expectations, who have an interest in providing, now actually have a framework through which they can have meaningful stakeholder engagement based on collective bargaining and provide direct support for factories that are taking the route of having collective bargaining agreements, right? So that there is an ability to really show exactly what it is that the brands are doing from a due diligence perspective. And I think just finally, just because I think, Daniel, you might be happy to hear this, and I think in terms of the commitments from the brands through the ACT process, it is related to labor costing. It doesn't matter whether it's the minimum wage or collective bargaining wage that has it, right? And there's a relationship between the collective bargaining agreements and the minimum wage process, which has delivered on higher wages over the last number of years, to actually look at to say, how can we now add an industrial relations structure to a process, make sure that there is continued sort of real wage growth, but also benefits for employers and brands, and making sure that there is a stable industry and a joint view to the future of the industry, future-proofing the industry, not just being reactive to what is happening. And I think that's the sort of benefit of what we're hoping this blueprint will allow us to do going forwards.
Thank you, David. And I think this is very valuable perspectives from you and Alistair and from Daniel as well. There's one last question I will ask perhaps Talita if she wants to come in, and it's a question about living wage benchmarks. So to what extent they can drive sectoral changes. I think in the case of Alistair, but also of David, we had very strong initiatives from some big companies, as Alistair said. I think it's probably valid for the garment industry as well. The pressure from consumers that motivates also the initiatives from these large multinationals. But then as can living wage benchmarks drive change? Do they matter? Talita, you want to say something about that?
Well, I can say that for now it's a little bit early to measure the impact on with the market on having a living wage. We don't have actually ways. We have beliefs that paying fairly also help our employees to be motivated, to be proud of the company. So, but there's no measure in this sense at this moment. Sorry.
Thank you, Talita. Well, thank you very much, all. I think we've had an extremely interesting discussion. I found it very enriching. Even thinking back at the work that we did with the focus group last year, I think there are many additional messages and thoughts that we can that we have discussed today. As I said, we are updating that note in particular to include the expert group and the work at the ILO, but we'll also look at whether there's more elements we can update in the note. So thank you very much to the speakers and to the audience for the interesting questions. We are looking to publish good practices in the coming weeks, and they are two of them are about living wages. So one good practice is on the support provided by Banana Link to social partners in Côte d'Ivoire to advance living wages, and there's a good practice on us recent work in Cambodia supporting collective bargaining agreements in the textile and garment industry. So thank you so much, and thank you for participating, and thanks again for the speakers for the very interesting discussion.